So today I want to talk to you all about 3 different aspects of accessibility that intersect with the technology that I use, which is stenography, machine stenography. So this talk will be divided into roughly 3 sections. The first I'll talk about my own job, which is steno captioning for people with hearing loss. The second part I'm going to talk, sort of intersecting with that, about the possibility of people with vision loss who use screen readers who might have a leg up in becoming stenographers. And there's a great need for them, and there's also terrible underemployment among the the blind and low vision community. So I think there's real potential there that has been untapped up till now. And then the last part, which I probably won't be saying that much about, but which I think is really potentially very fruitful, is steno as a means of augmentative and alternative communication, because it's currently the only conversational speed text input method yet devised. So first I'll start with what I do. There are approximately 35 million people with hearing loss. Some people have estimated up to as much as 45 million people. In the previous talk we had the estimate of 36 million, but just as a rough general estimate, 35 million people with hearing loss. That includes mild, moderate, severe, and profound hearing loss. So the majority of those people are in the mild to moderate range and acquired their hearing loss later in life after they already learned their first language. The minority of those people have severe to profound hearing loss and had that early in life. So those people generally know sign language, with some exceptions. But the people who acquired their hearing loss later in life generally do not know sign language. The estimate seems to be around 700,000 people know ASL, which leaves about over 34 million people who don't speak sign language, have a lot of difficulty in learning it because it is a very complex, it's an amazing language, but it's difficult to learn a language after you've become an adult. And so for those people who may possibly have mild to moderate hearing loss, or might even be late deafened and be in the severe to profound range later in life, real-time captioning is the best accommodation for them. There are also lots of other really useful things that captioning can do for people, such as offering assistance to people who are not necessarily fluent in English. They can get a lot more access by being able to read and listen to English at the same time. That's also true for people learning how to read English, people with dyslexia, auditory processing, and people who benefit from multimodal input, meaning that being able to read something and listen to it at the same time is more easily processed by them cognitively, or even just more enjoyable for them to be able to retain their attention on what's being said. By the way, my slides are completely graphics free. I could say that's because I wanted to make them absolutely accessible to everyone in the audience. It's actually because I procrastinated and didn't have time to add graphics. But that's why there will be no English descriptions in this talk. There are some alternatives to steno captioning. One is QWERTY text expansion, systems known as Typewell and cPrint, where someone uses a system usually by typing a word without vowels or with various other techniques that they can use on a QWERTY keyboard, where they can sort of paraphrase and summarize what's being said. Some people appreciate this accommodation if they have slow reading speeds, if what's being said is fairly easy to compress, it's not terribly dense and not terribly full of really precise language that has to be repeated verbatim. But in a lot of cases, it's not an appropriate accommodation because it's much slower. It doesn't necessarily provide 100% of the information, and it doesn't provide 100% of the syntax and the tone and the verbatim wording that's being used. So some people really miss all of the precise verbatim language. It is cheaper, it is quicker to train, but it is not a full and equal accommodation for people with hearing loss in all cases. There's voice writing, which is where people repeat what's being said into a microphone, and that is then processed by a voice recognition system that's trained to their voice and that has been set up with various shortcuts and commands and text processing macros. That is easy to train to, say, a 75 to 85% accuracy range, but the problem with that is that even if you go up to 90%, that's an error every 10 words, which means basically an error every sentence. And the problem with language is that it's so granular that if you put an error in every sentence, someone can be just like thrown completely off track and have no idea what's being talked about, because just one small mistake can alter the entire meaning of the paragraph. So 90% accuracy sounds good to the layman, but it's actually really abysmal. There are, of course, voice writers who train very hard and are very talented and spend a lot of time customizing their voice recognition software so that they can input text pretty accurately. But these people are rare. The training period is actually very long, sometimes arguably longer than that for stenography to get to full real-time verbatim accuracy. And there are a lot of other limitations that honestly make it so that for the very most challenging and difficult jobs that require the highest speed and accuracy, voice writing is not usually the best accommodation. People always come to me and ask, what about automatic speech recognition, where you just turn on Siri or some other, computer, drag and dictate, and you just put the microphone in the middle of the table and have people talk into it. The results of this are wildly variable. Sometimes you can get fairly good results for brief periods, assuming ideal conditions, where you have a single speaker, ideally with a standard American accent, good diction. Voice recognition systems tend to pick up men better than women, without any technical jargon, without background music, audio interference, completely 100% good, pristine audio. Then you can get sometimes okay output, but the instant you change any one of those variables, the output can suddenly just tank, and you'll get complete gibberish. If someone has an accent, or if you're talking about something that uses vocabulary that's not in the system, it will suddenly become incomprehensible. Even under the best conditions, you really can't just set it and go. Like, you need someone to be editing mistakes and filling in omissions in real time. But I'll tell you, that's not feasible in a lot of cases. A few weekends back, there was a very big tech conference in Barcelona where they actually had trained voice writers. They had one person who was re-speaking everything that was being said into his trained voice recognition system. One person was then editing it and consolidating it, and another person was sending out the lines as they were edited. Apparently it was disastrous. They were far, far behind the speaker. They were omitting whole words, phrases, and sentences, and there was a lot of inaccuracy. And after 2 days of the conference, the organizers of the conference actually fired that team and brought in my own company. Well, I've been working to help this company. I'm not the CEO, but it's called White Coat Captioning. And they brought in us, a team of 3 steno captioners, and we jumped in, and suddenly everyone was saying how amazing and wonderful the captioning was, where there had been really terrible press of people saying, captions are awful, they're distracting, I don't like looking at them, why are they spending money on captions, blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly, when we started providing fast and accurate captions, everyone started tweeting, oh my God, captions are so helpful, I love them, I want these at every conference. So quality really matters, and just setting up an automated cheap system can really, come back to bite you. This is what I always say, it's my own little pithy bon mot. Unless and until the singularity arrives, I will not be out of a job. Because there will always be situations where a human intelligence will be better than a machine intelligence. Until they ascend to godhood and become smarter than all of us, in which case, a lot of us are gonna be out of jobs, not just me. So, I love what I do. My job, makes me so happy. I'm a freelancer. I get to set my own rates and hours. I make a really good living. I can live in New York and provide for my wife and have a lot of money left over, which is amazing because I've worked in various accessibility fields before this. I was a personal care attendant for a lawyer with Lou Gehrig's disease. I worked in a group home for people with developmental disabilities, and while those were really awesome jobs as well, they paid very, very little. And now that I'm in a job that actually pays me enough to have a really comfortable middle-class income, I love it. There's huge demand for it, and it's rising because as the baby boomer generation is getting older, these are people who actually have been familiar with technology and used to working with technology for most of their lives, or at least a good portion of their lives, which is not quite true for the generation before them. So the very old people right now mostly don't know about captioning, are not familiar with it, and don't realize that it is a possible accommodation for them. But the people who are coming into senior citizenship right now have seen captioning, have used closed captioning on TV, and they know more about their own ADA rights and are willing to ask for it. So the demand for captioning is going up and up and up and up. It's also just a really cool job. I can specialize in the things I'm most interested in medical and technical work, tech conferences, medical schools. I've done English classes. I've done programming conferences. It's all wonderful, and there's so much variety out there that people can really pick and choose and work in the fields that they're most interested in. And you also get to help, sometimes these amazing, brilliant deaf people, get through school and attain their careers and have business meetings with clients, and you get to be a fly on the wall with people who are extremely accomplished in their field and are doing what they do best, and you're facilitating that, and it's a really cool feeling. There are also other stenographic jobs, which I personally don't do, but which I think are perfectly valid and useful jobs. Deposition reporting for lawyers in deposition rooms, also in the courtroom, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of stenography. There's transcription for businesses who don't necessarily need real-time access, but want very quick transcripts for financial calls and for business meetings like that. And then, of course, broadcast captioning, which is captioning for television, mostly news and sports, both of which I despise, so I will never do broadcast captioning myself, but a lot of people are really into that. And salaries range from healthy to extraordinary. So depending on how good you are and how much you are willing to work and what kind of connections you're able to make, you can make very, very good money. Steno has a terrible problem, though, which is that the people who have been doing this job for the last several decades are on the verge of retiring. And our pipeline is really bad because most stenographic schools are for-profit trade schools. They charge often egregious tuition costs. And there's an 85% dropout rate. So 15% of people go through the school in 2 to 4 years and emerge and get a job and are happy and are able to pay off their loans and have a great career for the rest of their lives. The other 85% have spent sometimes $4,000 on hardware, $5,000 on software, and up to $20,000 on tuition. And if they can't reach the graduation speed, they just drop out with nothing to show for it and terrible financial burdens on them. So I think there is an exploitation process going on, but the upside of that also is that basically we don't have enough stenographers filling in the gaps that people are retiring to meet the current demand, and certainly not the rising demand that's exploding all the time. And this prohibitively expensive barrier to entry that I'm talking about, I've actually taken some steps to try to moderate. So the software that Stan is using to caption me, that's $5,000 software. The software that I was using this morning to caption everybody was free. I commissioned and helped to design this software that is open source and free, and now anyone can use it. It's cross-platform. The hardware that Stan and I are using to caption professionally, about $4,000, $5,000, but my software works with a $100 keyboard. And then we've also started the process of online training. We've got a free online textbook, a bunch of drilling software and games. We're starting a project called Steno Arcade, which is hopefully going to be taking off the next few months. That will be a game arcade tutorial and drilling suite. It should be really fun. So that prohibitively expensive barrier to entry has been in place up until about 2010, but since the Open Steno project got going, that is now no longer an issue. But we still have the problem of not enough people learning Steno, and certainly not enough people succeeding in Steno and then making it their careers. So this goes to the second prong of what I want to talk about, which is the terrible underemployment for people with vision loss. Often it's just a matter of prejudice and ignorance. People, are completely qualified. They have, great GPAs, great job experience, everything they need. They go to the office, have their interview, and the potential employer sees the white cane or the dog and just says, "No, I'm sorry, we don't have what you need here. We can't accommodate you. You would put off our clients. You wouldn't interact with the other workers. Obviously they can't say that out loud because they could get sued for it, but they're thinking." And a lot of extremely qualified blind and low vision people are just not getting hired for no reason other than their vision loss, even if they can't necessarily prove that in a court of law. This is why I think that the blind and low vision population, particularly those who are experienced with screen readers and stenography, could be a match made in heaven. For one thing, just talking about the job itself, a lot of captioning is done remotely, which means essentially you could say that most remote captioners work, in quotes, blind. They aren't on site, they're not looking at the PowerPoint slides. Sometimes they'll get them in advance and can prepare them and put those, special words and names into their dictionary. But they're working from their own home office, sending the text over the internet and getting the audio through Skype or some other VoIP system. All interaction with clients is conducted by email or phone. So they don't necessarily have to disclose. If you have a blind stenographer, no one needs to know that they're a blind stenographer. As long as they can do the job and everything comes out accessibly in text, which the majority of what we do does, they can set their own rates and set their own hours and build their own business. And if they don't feel like talking about it, no one needs to know that they're blind. And they're on an absolutely equal level with other stenographers who are sitting in their same offices and might have perfect vision, but still can't see what's in the room. It's also great that it's a job that you can do from home. Remote work generally pays a little bit less than on-site work, but there's a ton of it, and the demand for it is increasing all the time. So why do I think that people who use screen readers are particularly suited to learning stenography? So I'm just going to read some of the numbers that I've got up on the screen here. The average rate of speech is around 180 words per minute. In order to graduate with a certificate in Steno, you need to reach 225 words per minute. The merit certificate that I hold is 260 words per minute, which means like the elite, top stenography certificate. And then the world record, which I have not attained, I'll tell you, is 360 words per minute. So the very fastest stenographer in the world can write at 360 words per minute. But as anyone who has either used a screen reader or knows someone who does use a screen reader, 360 words per minute is nothing, right? These people are listening at speeds of like 800, 900. I'm curious. So who here, raise your hand if you have your screen reader set to over 800 words per minute? Over 600? Yeah, so we've got one, all right. Over 500? Yeah, we've got 3. Yeah, see? So that's nothing. Now, of course, you'll say, well, I don't know that necessarily being able to hear and understand something at that speed is the same as being able to input it or write it, right? But this is my untested hypothesis, because there's no data on this, there's been no research on this, but just anecdotally, but from what I've observed, the people who do well in Steno school are people who read very quickly, speak very quickly, and are just generally quick. I have a feeling that it's a speech comprehension issue far more than an actual finger speed issue. Because if you look, if anyone looks over at Stan, his hands are not moving that quickly. It's not a matter of his muscles being able to move faster than other people's. It's a matter of his brain being able to take in language, translate it into Steno, and then put it back out again. And I have a feeling that most of the people, the 85% of people who get stuck somewhere along the way before they reach 225 words per minute, it's because their brain is not used to working at those speeds. And when they hear speech at that, going that quickly, their brain shuts down. So I think people who have had, like I said, I don't have any data on this. I really want to get data on this. I think people who have had practice listening at those speeds will be a lot better suited to learn how to translate that into Steno and then write it. There are a few limitations, but honestly, I don't think any of them are insurmountable. I've noticed some blind people have spelling issues, which is totally understandable. I think they would probably need some sort of, regimented, intensive, spelling refresher course, especially with homonyms, being able to differentiate words that sound alike and be able to know the correct meaning and the correct spelling of those. But that's something that you can, offer as an independent course. That's something that is absolutely learnable and has nothing to do with vision loss per se. Real-time output monitoring can be tricky. If you're using your screen reader at the same time that you're trying to caption and you want to make sure that you haven't made mistakes, you're getting dual audio. So that's why I think probably people who know Braille and have refreshable Braille displays and are able to monitor their output by touch rather than by hearing will have a bit of an advantage over people who rely completely on screen readers. But again, not insurmountable. Certainly voice writers, as I spoke about before, are listening at the same time that they're speaking. So there's no reason why a blind stenographer couldn't be monitoring their, monitoring the speech of what they're writing at the same time as they're monitoring the output of their screen reader. Sometimes we do get inaccessible prep material, PDFs that don't have extractable text, but that's something that you can work out with your clients. And you usually do get that at least ahead of time so that you can fix any errors before you have to write live. And then there is, like I said, some on-site work that can sometimes pay better than the remote work. But even so, I know a lot of fully sighted stenographers who do 100% remote work. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Okay, so that is my pitch for why I really want to reach out to the blind and low vision community to get them into Steno. And the big advantage here is that because of the Open Steno project, people can give Steno a try without spending that $8,000 to $20,000 in tuition and equipment and software costs. They can just sort of pick it up, buy a $100 keyboard, give it a try, play some of the games. That Steno Arcade is going to be fully accessible. We're working with a specifically accessible game development studio to make this game accessible. And if it's not for you, that's fine. You've lost $100 in some of your time. You haven't totally thrown away years of your life and gone tens of thousands of dollars into debt. So I feel like now that the barriers to entry are low, I think we can reach out to the blind and low vision community with much less risk and hopefully recruit a number of them into our ranks. Okay, so the final thing that I'm going to talk about, and I think we're right on track, so I've got a little less than 10 minutes, is Steno as augmentative and auxiliary communication. So, or augmentative and alternative communication, I think is the official acronym. So this is completely over to the side of what I've been talking about before. This is not captioning for people with hearing loss, but this is communication for people with speech disabilities. And there are a variety of reasons why people aren't able to use their voices to speak, or are not comfortable with using their voices to speak, or even can use their voices to speak for a short period of time per day in quiet rooms, but can't necessarily do it in large venues or for long periods. There are people who have issues with their mouth or their larynx. There are people who have had surgery or have had cancer or other debilitations, paralysis from stroke, cerebral palsy, muscular sclerosis, and also people who don't necessarily have physiological limitations but might have cognitive or psychological limitations that don't allow them to use their voices to speak, but will allow them to communicate via augmentative and alternative communication. Currently, a lot of this is done using either proprietary tablets or Android tablets or iPads, with apps that often have icons and nested menus where you sort of pick the topic of what you want to say and then you drill down and go into menus that offer you certain predictive options. That can be fast for things that you're saying very frequently, but it can be very slow and frustrating if you want to sort of break outside of those pre-scripted conversations and say something new. Some people just use plain QWERTY. They just type everything from scratch, or they use text expansion systems where it's a little bit faster and more efficient than QWERTY, but not much. The trouble is that none of these are conversational speed. The only way, like Stephen Hawking, for instance, if he wants to give a speech, he has to program the entire speech into his AAC device ahead of time and then just press play and sit back. He can't actually respond in real time because there's too much of a pause, and conversation is halted or disrupted, or the interlocutors find themselves becoming frustrated with the delays, which of course is on them. A little patience goes a long way, but I think people who use AAC devices, many of them would very much like to have conversational speed text input so that they can go back and forth without any delay to the people that they're talking to. Steno is the only accommodation that I've ever heard of that will allow for that. Now, you do need to have a relatively high cognitive level. I think slightly higher than people who are able to write in QWERTY, because there are some things that you need to coordinate in terms of translating the phonemes into the Steno code that will then be translated into the English text. It's a little more, the cognitive load is a little higher than just typing the letters. But, and you obviously also need some coordination. I believe there might be modified versions of Steno that takes less than 10 fingers, but if so, I don't know them. And I think they would be a little tricky to implement. But I think if you have relatively good use of all 10 fingers, and I think there might be some allowance for accommodations in terms of spasticity, plasticity, and the ability to use certain fingers and not others, you might take a bit of a speed hit there, but it still might be faster than QWERTY. And then the output can be plugged into any text-to-speech engine. So you can carry around a little Bluetooth wireless speaker system and use any text-to-speech voice. and then basically communicate back and forth. In this very room, actually, there was a hackathon last spring, and Stan and I and a couple of other people put together an Android-based steno system that mounted on your belt, used a 3D printed steno machine that's available for about $300, and you just put your Android phone on the system, and you can walk around, and basically, if you know steno, and have the finger dexterity to be able to use it, you are able to walk around and let your phone speak for you, and you can just write any text you want. And it's just all out there. So it's certainly not the entire AAC community who would be able to learn steno and use this, and would have the physical and cognitive abilities to use steno. But I have a feeling that there's a significant portion of people who might really benefit from having conversational speed, text-to-speech via steno. So I really want to reach out to those people and offer them as much training as necessary, and also work on better and more seamless wearable hardware solutions, both wheelchair-mounted and ambulatory, that people can use, so that they can basically just have, you know, a voice that will function at 240 words a minute in their pocket or mounted to their jeans. So that is the end of my speech. If you want more information about steno, go to openstenoproject.org, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Any questions? Oh, yes.
I don't know if I missed it or blanked out for a second, but the QWERTY text expansion you had in one of your first slides, is that just like autocomplete?
Not
Could you repeat the question, please?
She wanted to know about the QWERTY text expansion that I was talking about earlier. So there's two main systems. One is called Typewell, one is called cPrint. Typewell it has sort of a generalized dictionary that basically consists of English words without their vowels, you know, with a couple of other exceptions. I think a couple of other shortcuts for common words where you just have to write one letter and then it'll expand into a big word. But so instead of, you know, writing, you know, having like 5 keystrokes for a word, it will maybe be 3 keystrokes, something like that. cPrint, which is an alternative text expansion system, I think uses more sort of like semi-phonetic shortcuts. So you'll have to sort of make up little sound-alike words that are easier to type and contain fewer keystrokes, and then those will expand out into the full words. But the speeds that people can achieve with these are usually not much above 130, 140 words per minute. So it's not sufficient for full verbatim speech, but it can sometimes be good if you want to compress and paraphrase a lot of, you know, a speech that is not very information dense. So you can just pick out the really important parts and compress them down. I sort of compare it to like the digest of a speech compared to the bullet points on a PowerPoint slide. Yes?
I was at an event, a highly technical event recently where stenography, I guess, was being done, but the words were so strange because they were so highly technical that it was always completely being, you know, completely wrong.
Yeah,
on the
that's
screen.
frustrating.
How do you handle something like that?
Well, the company that I work for specializes in tech conferences, so they only use stenographers who are very familiar with tech jargon. Because the comprehension problem, it's not an issue with the steno machine or the stenographic system. It's an issue with understanding what's being said and being able to output it properly. So as long as you know what people are talking about, your steno machine will be able to write it. But if you don't have any familiarity with that, then it won't. So it's a matter of finding people who are technological specialists and not just using a general steno captioner or court reporter or someone who works with a very different vocabulary set than that's the one that's used in tech conferences.
I assume medical.
Medical as well, yeah. So go to whitecoatcaptioning.com for all your tech conference captioning needs. Sveta first.
I wanted to add something as well to the last question. Sometimes you see some odd words. I'm a deaf person myself, and I use real-time captioning a lot. So Mirabai often works with me, also Stan. They are 2 of the top stenographers. So you really have to make sure when you're ordering, you don't order court reporters. Because often they are not specialized in the field. As Mirabai said, there's about 400 certified stenographers in the country, and here in New York, I would say probably less than 10 who are greatly skilled. So if you want someone who can provide really great captioning, you have to be really careful. And often I will choose to use interpreters instead if I'm not sure of the quality of captioning.
Interesting.
Thank you. And I think one last question in the back, David.
In terms of, you mentioned something that piqued the special ed teacher in me.
Yeah.
We're seeing a huge increase in the population of students on the autistic spectrum. It's a combination of question and comment. Have you seen Steno being used for students? Because I know in terms of budget and cost prohibitiveness within schools, a lot of school districts, I would imagine, don't want to pay for it. Because I know every time we try and get services for a student, we always come up against the district saying no, just based on the money and not based on the student's need. So have you seen it being used for those populations?
So first, the question of elementary schools being able to use captioners. Yeah, it is really often the case that kids who want captioning do not get that accommodation. Some of it is, so by and large, one captioner will cost the same amount as a team of ASL interpreters because a captioner, it's ergonomically and mentally less fatiguing, so a captioner will be able to work 2 hours or more without a break, whereas ASL interpreters need to switch off. So the rate for captioning and interpreting on an hour-per-hour basis is usually the same. However, in elementary schools, interpreters generally make less than interpreters who are interpreting for the community or in colleges or in other cases. So it's hard to find captioners who will be willing to work for those sort of lower educational rates. And as you say, it's also difficult to find school districts that are willing to pay even those fairly low rates. So that's really a problem. You know, I think the inherent problem is really with locally funded school systems. That I know that there's a county in New Jersey, I think Bergen County, that they have captioning for their deaf and hard of hearing students. They're a very wealthy county and they can afford it, but in other places it's just not an option, and that's unjust and terrible, but it's simply the case. In terms of students without hearing loss who are on the autism spectrum, I have not heard of captioning being used for that, though I think there's a lot of opportunity there, because I think, you know, if they have good literacy, they often, speech or auditory processing disorders are very commonly correlated with being on the autism spectrum. And so if cognitively they're able to get that input through text, it can also often be a lot more useful than getting it through their ears. But that's not a standard enough accommodation that I think a lot of disability directors are willing to pay the money for that, though I think it could be of great benefit. So I think we're pretty much there.